Hello and welcome to a short video on the prioritization toolbox of the Pedestrian Infrastructure Assessment Toolkit. What's included? The Pedestrian Infrastructure Toolbox includes a Create Prioritization Workbook tool, a Prioritization Workbook, which is in Excel, and a Join Workbook to Layer tool. The Prioritization Toolkit enables you to prioritize improvement locations based on weighted factors and variables. And factors are the larger categories that represent community values, whereas variables are measurable aspects of factors. The toolbox enables you to determine how variables are scaled. Different variables will have different scales of raw score. For example, there may be only a couple of crashes at a location, but the annual average daily traffic might be in the tens of thousands. So there's a need to put those on the same scale so that they're comparable to each other, and that's what scaling is. And then finally, the improvement locations that are used by the toolbox can be identified either through the needs assessment toolbox that is provided with the pedestrian infrastructure assessment toolkit or through another process. These are the factors and variables that are provided with the PIAT. I think there are 7 factors and 27 variables. I'm not going to go through them all, but they are there's a table in the manual that describes these factors and variables, and also the format that each needs to be in to be used. So the Create Prioritization Workbook tool enables the selection of factors and variables for analysis. So this is where you select your factors and variables. It will then calculate raw scores in ArcGIS Pro based on the factors and variables that you select. And the details of how it makes those calculations are in the manual. So if you're curious to know how the measures are done, you can look there. The prioritization workbook, which is in Excel, computes prioritization scores based on weights that the user specifies, that you specify. And what a weight is a multiplier that is applied to factors and variables to indicate their relative importance in the overall score equation. And the user can also specify the rescaling methodology. So this is the methodology that is used for adjusting the raw scores to be on a common numeric scale so that they're comparable to each other. And then scores for each factor and the total score for each location are populated into the spreadsheet. And finally, the Join Workbook to Layer tool allows you to join the output from the prioritization workbook in Excel to the layer, so back to ArcPro, where you can analyze it there. And now I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Thaja again to demonstrate these tools.
Thank you, Jim. So prioritization toolbox, this can be accessed the same way as the other 2 toolboxes, and it has, so Jim mentioned 3 steps in it, but you only see 2 here. The reason is that one of the steps is actually not part of the ArcGIS environment. It's done entirely in Excel. So demonstrate that step as well. And that step actually comes in between these 2. The first one is the Create Prioritization Workbook. What this does is that it takes your layer that you're trying to prioritize, the projects, which is the different projects, and it applies all the spatial searches, measures all the variables that you select and whatnot, and writes the raw scores to an Excel table. That is what this tool does. So if I were to double click on it, So it has a series of inputs. The first one is the prioritization feature layer, and that again would be dependent on your purpose. And as you mentioned, you could use the needs assessment tool. Say you want to identify crossing gaps in your needs assessment using your needs assessment, and you can use those crossing gaps as an input to this layer. So that way you can, or you might have a completely different set of needs as well. You might have something like locations that you want to, projects that you want to prioritize near schools for safety and accessibility and such. So you can use any of those as well. And this layer can accept both point and line features as inputs. So for the demo purposes, we will use this layer called lines testing, which is again, I created a series of lines in this map, and those are here. You can see them. And these lines don't really represent any real project or anything. They're just something that we drew on the map randomly. So you select those lines. I'll leave those on there. And then each of those lines need a unique ID field, and that is what is used to join the results, which the input, to the Excel file later, and then like towards the last step of this prioritization toolbox. So you would need to keep this. This should be unique ID. If you don't have it, you can create it in the attribute table and like populate it as well. So same as the other tools, you would need the standard and Scratch geodatabases. You select those. And you will need to select output workbook, which is basically an Excel file. It's just asking where you want to save it. So you can browse to it and say, give it any title that you want. In this case, I'm just naming it testing demo. And the next step is to select the different variables and factors that you want to include. And if you notice, there is 7 of these here: opportunity constraints, stakeholder equity, connectivity, pedestrian potential, and safety. Those are the different factors. And if you expand them and select a factor, it gives you a drop down, not a drop. It gives you like options to select individual variables within the same factor. So if you don't, you can select any number that you want, and if you don't want to include it, you can unselect it again, which takes it away. And the opportunity, the details of these particular factors and variables and what they mean and how they are measured, that's all in the manual. So for the purposes of this demonstration, I will select the spatial variables that we have access to, which is, you can, like I said, you can select any combination of them. So I'm selecting all the variables in the bottom 4 factors here. So select this, it expands out. And if this specific variable that you don't want to include, you can uncheck it as you need. One thing to mention is that each of the variables here requires a specific type of input, that input layer that should be in the standard geodatabase. And the pre-populated geodatabase actually has the inputs for the equity, connectivity, pedestrian potential, and safety ones, which are all the spatial layers that is already present. But if you want to use any of the first 3 variables, those are project dependent. So those are customized to each individual project, and that's something that you would need to upload on your own using the import to geodatabase tool in the data management toolbox. So we select the variables and factors that are needed, and you hit run, and it basically, just like the other tools, you can click on the pop-up view details button to see the pop-up, and it'll start printing out different messages to let you know at what stage of the process is this particular analysis run is in. So because we selected a bunch of variables, this would take, depending on the size of your number of projects that you have and the variables that are selected, again, could be a few minutes, or it could be a few hours if you have a really large data set that you're trying to run this on. So as this is running, I will actually cancel this as soon as 1 or 2 messages print here. because we won't be able to run the whole thing within the time that we have for this webinar. So as this runs, it prints different messages, and typically those messages would tell you what variable is it calculating and like what stage of the process it's in. So what this tool is doing is that it's saving everything to this Excel file that we input as a input to the tool. I actually, while this is running, I have the Excel file already in place. Let me find that particular Excel file. So I'll close this and cancel this, but I'll show you what the outputs look like for this tool. So we'll go back, and I already saved this particular Excel file. So I'm gonna open this particular folder. You need to do this outside of ArcGIS, like I mentioned. So I will minimize this and show you the particular folder where it is. So it's on my, it depends on where you've saved it. So in this case, it's on my desktop. So I go to the correct location. It's in this PIAT webinar, and this is the file that I've already tested it ahead of time. So I open this, and it opens up the Excel file with all the results in there. So now we're in the second step of the analysis. This is the step that is outside of Excel. So it opens up an Excel file with a bunch of sheets here. And the sheet that is most important is this input-weight sheet. And that one is the place where you basically have a bunch of cells that have this green formatting. The green formatting indicates that those are the cells, those are the variables or factors that you have selected in your prioritization run. And those are the ones that you would be adjusting the weights to. And these weights here, if you notice on top, it says relative weight. So they don't have to total a value, they don't have to total 100, they don't have to be a given value. So they're all just relative to one another. So let's say for now, all of them are set as default equals 10, 10, 10. But if you might want to set that as something lower. You might want to, maybe you want to have a lower importance to this variable than the next one. So it automatically adjusts the weight in a percentage scale on the side. So that way you can pick and choose any combination of weights that you want. And the default ones here that are populated, they don't really, they're just all equal, and they don't mean any, they're not recommended values or anything. They're just something that are placeholder values. So once you have adjusted any weights that you need in any way, there's this other thing here that says rescaling method. And some variables can be rescaled in a certain way, some are not. An example would be this value here. It says rescaling method is none. And if you click on this little button, it only has one option. That's because this pedestrian network is a variable that can take a value of 0 or 100. So there's no rescaling required for that. So it just removes there's no rescaling for that specific value. Whereas for most of the rest of them, they have like percentiles, they have quartiles, deciles, and the specifics on how this rescaling method is done is in the manual. The details are given in there. So by default, everything is rescaled using percentile. You can pick a different type of rescaling and use that, whichever chooses your value. And then there's also the categorical value. For this is where you basically have these values on the side here. For functional class, these values are different values, and these don't necessarily, 7 in this case is local streets, 6 is like minor collectors and whatnot. And you might want to give your own custom weights for it. So that is what the categorical value does. And then at the bottom here, you have factors. And if you notice, the first 3 are not formatted green. That's because those are the variables that we did not select in our test run. We only selected the bottom 4, which are here. And because they're all equal weights, each of them is getting a 25% weight towards the final one. But let's say you want to increase this to 30. That as soon as that is done, now the total, this gives each of the equity variable here, in this case, has 3 times the weight of any of the other 3, which is what this adjusted variable is. Um, so in summary, you basically have to only update just the green formatted cells. And for raw scores, so this tab is what the previous tool wrote these raw values to this Excel file. And these values, in this case, it depends on how they're being measured. And you might notice that these are just numbers, and they have different different scales. Some of them are less than 1. Some of them have like greater values, and some of them might be like slightly larger values. So they that is what rescaling does, is that it rescales them on a different scale. And in this case, if you go to the weighted scores variable and look at the same numbers, now these are the different rescale values with the weight applied that you've given. So these are now each of these can be compared to each other instead of, because the raw values cannot be compared to each other. So these are the individual variable scores, and then there's another sheet which says weighted scores for factors, and these are different factors. And the first 3 here, they're blank because there's no factors, we didn't select them. And the last 4 here, those are the factors that we've selected, and this total score is calculated based on those variable weights and factor weights. So this is the final prioritization score using the given set of variable weights and rescaling methods and whatnot. So in my case, this automatically calculates it, but in some cases, the Excel doesn't automatically rerun the calculations when you update the weights. And if you want to ensure that it calculates it, the way to do that would be in this formulas option right at the top here. If you select that, it has on the right here, it has this option that says calculate now. So if you were to click on that calculate now, in the bottom here, mine it's saying it already disappeared because it finished the calculations, but I'll show it to you when I click it again. So it says calculating right here. So it'll recalculate all of this formulas for you. And in some cases, Excel does it automatically. Some cases it doesn't. It entirely depends on what type of settings you have going on your computer at a given point. So just to be sure, it's probably better to just say calculate now to ensure that it has calculated. Once this is calculated, the important things is to save it. So you can basically save it, and as soon as it's saved, you will need to close it, because if you don't close it, then ArcGIS in the next step will sometimes has issues accessing a file that's open like this. So before you save it, once you save it, make sure that the costs and whatnot are maybe what you're expecting, and you can readjust the weights as you need, play around with them, and try any combination of weights. Once all the calculations are done, save it. Now closing it. Once this is closed, now we're ready for the next step of this, which would be my Excel open again, which would be again back to the toolboxes where it is. So now we've done this create prioritization tool workbook tool, and then the second step, which is in the Excel file, we've went through that. And the third step is now we need to join those scores that Excel calculated back to this layer so that we can actually look at the results on the map. And in order to do that, you click on the join prioritization workbook tool layer, and you select the prioritization feature layer. This is the same layer that we used in the first step. And again, you have to select the primary key, which is the same field that you used in the first step. That's how ArcGIS knows which score belongs to which particular project. And then you would need to select the your standard geodatabases, because that's where all the backend processing happens. And then now you need to select your Excel file, which was saved before. So in this case, it is this file here. So you selected it, and you run, you select how you want to save the output feature class, which is the layer, and then you hit run. And when you hit run, just like the other tools, it'll start giving you messages. And what it is essentially doing is that for each of the scores within the Excel file, it's picking the individual weighted variables, weighted factors, and the total scores, and it's all writing it to the input layer as part of the attribute table. And you can use those scores to kind of symbolize the map in any way you want, which I'll demonstrate shortly. And that's basically what this tool is doing. I'll wait until it prints a couple messages just to show you like how this is probably going to look like when you run this tool on your end. While this is running, I can show you what the finished output looks like for this. So I'll turn off this layer here, and we already have a finished output that is pre-populated. So if I were to turn that on, I'll minimize this. So this is the different scores that we calculated, that we pre-calculated ahead of time. So in this case, because we only have 5 features here, they all have different scores, and this feature here has the highest score using the factors selected. And you can actually go and click on the layer itself to look at the details of the scores themselves. So that opens up a little pop-up window. Well, let's wait until the pop-up window opens. So this is the pop-up window here, and this is the primary key field, which is the project ID, and then you have all the raw scores here and the variable score. So the raw score is 3.94 for disability, and the variable is like 11.11. Similarly, it basically has all these other ones, and then it also has this total score value, which is the overall prioritization score that we saw in the Excel file earlier. So that is what the results look like. And if you want to symbolize it, so right now it's symbolized using total score. If you want to symbolize it using a different variable, different attribute, that's you could do it in any way you want. So that's let's go back to where this tool was running. So right now at this point it has 4 messages that it's printed. So what it's doing is that first it is reading and it is writing the raw and weighted rescaled scores for variables, and it's showing what variable it is writing it at, and it kind of goes through all the variables and like writes those messages. Because this takes a few minutes to run, I'll close it up in the interest of time. Yeah, there it is, and we cancel that one. But that's the prioritization toolbox.
Teja, I have some questions, or a question and a comment. The question is, why might someone want to consider selecting a different rescaling methodology than the one that is provided as default percentile?
Yeah, so maybe so in some cases, if let's say percentile score is going to give you a score between 0 and 100, and the gradation is pretty fine. If let's say you have 100 projects, you're going to have 0, 1, 2, 3, 4 up to 100. And sometimes that might be too much, too fine for like to be able to work with. And if you were to have it in say groups of 10s, you could say I want to use deciles as my rescaling method. Or in some cases, you might want to use linear methods. That way if you have a raw score of 1,000 for one of the variable and a raw score of 1 for the other variable, if you scale them linearly, it'll be a much more of a it retains the magnitude of those raw scores a little bit better. So depending on what your purpose is, you might want to pick like one or the other.
And I think I'm not sure if you mentioned this, but I know that it's incorporated into the table that you can adjust the maximum score and the minimum score, right? And why would you want to
Yes,
do that?
that is correct. And that is something that I skipped over as I was mentioning. I can open this up and kind of show what that does. So in addition to the scaling method, there's the score range. So in this case, the minimum score is 1 and maximum score is 100. In some cases, you may not want to give a score of 1 to a given project. You might want to have like a baseline score of, say, 10 or 15 or something like that for a given particular variable. In that case, you can adjust that here and say 15 to 100 as your layer. And in some cases, you might also want to cap a given score much below 100. So you could say that value is 80 or something like that. So yeah, thanks for bringing it up.
And then one comment is that I noticed you selected a lot of variables.
Mhm.
And the comment is just that typically that's not needed and that sometimes less is more and it can be um, your results might be clearer if you're actually choosing fewer variables rather than more, clearer in terms of the effect of each variable on the overall score.
Correct. Yep. Because I selected so many variables, if I were to go back to the final score, it's much harder for me to figure out what variable played what part in that score. And as you mentioned, less is more in some cases. So if you have only 3 variables, then you can more clearly define how your final score, like more clearly kind of trace how your final score is calculated.
Okay, well, thank you, Teja.